April 25th, 1935, Anzac Day. The sun was burning over Coogee Beach. The aquarium baths were packed. Families, soldiers on leave, children with ice cream melting down their wrists. They'd all paid 6 pence to see the monster from the deep. A 14-foot tiger shark, 4 meters of muscle and teeth, circling the tiled pool like a prisoner. But today, the beast wasn't swimming. It was thrashing, slamming its head against the concrete walls. It was sick. The crowd leaned in. Some tapped on the pool edge. They thought it was part of the show. But then the shark convulsed, seized up in the murky water. Its jaws opened wide. It vomited into the pool. First, a dead rat floated to the surface. Then, a bird, feathers matted with bile. And then, something else. Bobbing in the foam was a human arm. Left side, muscular, pale as bone. The police arrived in minutes. They assumed it was tragedy, a swimmer eaten alive by a predator. But when they fished the limb out of the water, they found 2 things that changed Australian history. 1, a tattoo of 2 boxers sparring. 2, the arm hadn't been bitten off. It had been cut off. Cleanly, with a knife. And tied around the wrist was a length of rope. The shark was innocent. It had just vomited up the evidence of a gangland execution. Welcome to 1930s Sydney, a city of razor gangs, cocaine smugglers, and boat builders who knew how to make things disappear. It was supposed to be the perfect crime. There was just one problem. The shark got sick. Sydney in 1935 was a city built on 2 currencies, fear and favors. The Depression had turned men into wolves. Unemployment sat at 30%. The dole queues stretched around city blocks. Women sold flowers on street corners for pennies. Boys shined shoes for scraps. And in the shadows between the Art Deco towers and the wharves, the razor gangs ruled the night. They called them razor gangs because that's what they used. Not guns, too loud, too expensive, too much attention from the coppers. Razors were quiet. A flash of steel in the dark, a slash across the face that left a man marked for life. 3 inches of Sheffield steel that fit in a waistcoat pocket and could carve a reputation in seconds. The gangs controlled the sly-grog shops, the cocaine trade, the brothels in Darlinghurst and King's Cross. They had names like poetry and violence, the thieves of the night, the blood-stained angels. And the women, Kate Lee and Tilly Devine, ran empires from behind their parlor doors while their husbands rotted in jail. Into this world walked Jim Smith. Not a big player, not a gang boss, just a boxer with fast hands and a faster mouth. He fought in the underground rings down at Woolloomooloo, bare-knuckle bouts in warehouse basements where men bet their weekly wages on which fighter would still be standing when the blood stopped flowing. Smith was good, not great. Good enough to make money. Good enough to make connections. But Smith's real talent wasn't in the ring. It was in the spaces between. He knew people. He heard things. And he understood that information in Sydney's underworld was worth more than gold. He ran errands for Patrick Brady. Brady was a forger, the best in the Southern Hemisphere. He could fake a passport, a land deed, a banknote so perfect that even the Reserve Bank clerks couldn't spot the difference. He worked out of a printing shop in Ultimo, legitimate business in the front, counterfeit currency in the back. Brady didn't carry razors. He carried fountain pens and charm. He wore expensive suits and ate at the Australia Hotel. He looked like a businessman, because he was one, just in a business that happened to be illegal. Smith also worked for Reginald Holmes. Holmes was different. Old money. a boatbuilder who owned a workshop at Lavender Bay with a view of the harbor that would make a king weep. He built racing yachts for wealthy men and smuggling vessels for criminals. Sometimes the same boat served both purposes. Holmes moved in two worlds: champagne garden parties on Saturday afternoons and cocaine shipments on moonless nights. He had a wife who wore pearls and a mistress who knew where the bodies were buried. Smith ran messages between them, picked up packages, delivered envelopes stuffed with cash. He was useful because he was invisible. Just another boxer, another face in the crowd at the dog tracks and the two-up games. Nobody noticed him. But Smith made a mistake that winter. He started noticing things he wasn't supposed to notice. He started remembering conversations he was meant to forget, and when the coppers picked him up one rainy night in March for a street brawl he didn't start, they gave him a choice: jail time or cooperation. Smith chose cooperation. He became a police informant, started feeding the detectives scraps of information about Brady's forgery operation, about Holmes's smuggling routes, just enough to keep himself out of Long Bay jail, just enough to feel powerful. But in a city where secrets were currency and betrayal was blood sport, Jim Smith had just signed his own death warrant. He just didn't know it yet. The last time anyone saw Jim Smith alive was April 20th, 1935, 5 days before Anzac Day, 5 days before a shark would tell his story. Jim Smith started asking for more money in March. Not much at first, just an extra quid here and there when he delivered Brady's packages, a few pounds when he picked up a crate from Holmes's boat shed, small amounts. The kind of money that could be a tip or a favor or a thank you for discretion. But by April, the amounts weren't small anymore. Brady saw it first. Smith came to the print shop on a Tuesday afternoon with a package of forged land titles that was supposed to go to a buyer in Wallara. But before he handed it over, Smith mentioned, casually, like he was commenting on the weather, that he'd noticed the serial numbers on the banknotes Brady had been printing last week didn't quite match the Reserve Bank's numbering system. A small detail, the kind of thing only someone paying very close attention would notice. Brady's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's so?" Smith shrugged. "Probably nothing. Just thought you'd want to know someone was watching close enough to spot it." Brady understood the game immediately. This wasn't a helpful observation. It was a threat wrapped in velvet. Smith was saying, "I know enough to destroy you. Pay me, or I'll use it." Asterisk. He paid. £20, enough to keep Smith quiet for a week. But blackmail is like blood in the water. Once it starts, the sharks come circling. Reginald Holmes got the same treatment 2 days later. Smith arrived at Lavender Bay just after sunset when the wealthy yacht owners had gone home and the workshop was quiet. Holmes was in his office going over shipping manifests, the real ones, not the ones he showed the customs inspectors. Smith knocked on the doorframe. "Got a delivery for you." Holmes looked up. "I wasn't expecting anything tonight." Smith smiled. "Not from you. From your friend in Melbourne, the one who sends the packages with the white powder that isn't flour." Holmes was smarter than Brady, richer, more connected. He had friends in the police force, in the city council, the legal chambers where judges drank brandy after court. But he also had more to lose. A wife, a reputation, a business that operated on both sides of the law but needed the legal side to survive. He didn't argue. He opened his safe and counted out £30 in crisp notes. "This is a one-time payment," Holmes said, his voice quiet and dangerous. "Don't come back." Smith pocketed the money. "Wouldn't dream of it, Mr. Holmes." But Smith did come back, 3 days later. Then 4 days after that. By mid-April, he was bleeding both men dry. £20 from Brady, 30 from Holmes, 50 between them every week. For men operating in cash businesses where every transaction left no record, it was sustainable but intolerable. And both Brady and Holmes knew the same iron truth. Blackmailers never stop. They bleed you until there's nothing left, and then they sell what they know to someone else. The two men met on April 18th. Not openly, they weren't friends, didn't run in the same circles. But desperation makes allies of enemies. They sat in a back room at a sly-grog shop in Ultimo, where the bartender knew to see nothing and remember less. Holmes spoke first. "How much has he taken from you?" Brady lit a cigarette. £120 since March. You? 180. The numbers hung in the smoky air between them. "He'll go to the coppers eventually," Brady said. "Men like Smith always do. They squeeze until the well runs dry. Then they sell the information for immunity." Holmes stared at the amber liquid in his glass. "Unless we stop him first." They didn't discuss details that night. Didn't say the word murder out loud. But both men left that pub with the same understanding. Jim Smith had made himself a problem. And in Sydney's underworld, problems had solutions. Permanent ones. 2 days later, on April 20th, Jim Smith disappeared. No one reported him missing. He had no family in Sydney, no close friends. The men he drank with at the pubs assumed he'd left town. The women he knew figured he was lying low after a bad fight. The police, the ones who weren't on his payroll as an informant, didn't notice he was gone. But somewhere in the cold, dark waters off Sydney Harbour, something terrible had already been done. And in 5 days, a sick shark would bring it back to the surface. Jim Smith arrived at Reginald Holmes's boat shed just after midnight on April 20th. He'd been told to come alone. Holmes had a job for him, a special delivery that needed to happen after dark when the customs inspectors were home in their beds. Smith knew what that meant. Smuggling run. The kind of work that paid double and asks no questions. He needed the money. The police had been pressuring him for more information about Brady's operation, and Brady had started looking at him with eyes like broken glass. Smith was caught between two fires, and the only way out was cash. Enough money to disappear. Melbourne, maybe, or Queensland, where nobody knew his face. The workshop doors were open. Yellow light spilled out across the wet planks. Smith stepped inside. Holmes was waiting. So was Patrick Brady. Smith stopped. His hand moved toward his pocket, not for a weapon, just a nervous habit. But Brady was already moving. He came around from behind a boat hull, fast for a man in an expensive suit, and Smith saw the cosh too late. Smith went down hard. The world tilted. His vision blurred. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't work. Brady hit him again. And again. Clinical. Methodical. No anger, just efficiency. When it was over, the boat shed was silent except for the sound of water against the pilings and two men breathing hard in the lamplight. Holmes looked at the body on the floor. "We need to move quickly." Brady was already pulling a tarp from a shelf. "I brought the trunk." The trunk was Army surplus, heavy-gauge steel, the kind used to ship equipment overseas during the war, big enough for a man if you made him fit. Brady had bought it from a surplus yard in Woolloomooloo 2 days ago, paid cash, gave a false name. But there was a problem. Smith was a boxer. Broad shoulders, thick arms. He wouldn't fit, not whole. Holmes fetched a saw from his workbench. the kind he used for cutting timber frames for boat hulls. Sharp, well-maintained. He didn't say anything. Neither did Brady. Some things didn't need words. It took them 3 hours. They worked in shifts. Brady would work until his hands cramped, then Holmes would take over. They didn't speak, except for terse instructions. Hold this. More weight. Tie it tighter. They were businessmen solving a business problem. The fact that the problem had been a human being 6 hours ago was something they couldn't afford to think about. By 4 in the morning, the trunk was packed and weighted. Lead fishing weights tied to the handles with marine rope, heavy enough to sink, deep enough to stay down. They loaded it onto Holmes's speedboat, a sleek racing craft he'd built the previous summer, fast enough to outrun the water police if it came to that. They motored out into the harbor just as the sun was beginning to bleed red across the horizon. 3 miles offshore, where the shipping lanes ended and the deep water began, they stopped. Brady cut the engine. Silence rushed in. Just the slap of waves against the hull and the cry of gulls circling overhead. They lifted the trunk together, heaved it over the side. It sank like a stone. The surface closed over it. The ripples faded. Within seconds, there was no evidence it had ever existed. Holmes started the engine again. Neither man spoke on the way back to shore. They parted ways at the workshop. Brady went home to his wife. Holmes went to his office. Both men showered, changed clothes, burned what they'd been wearing in backyard incinerators. By 9 o'clock that morning, they were at their respective businesses, acting as if April 20th had been just another night. The perfect crime. Except the rope around one of the pieces hadn't been tied properly. Or maybe the weight shifted during the descent. Or maybe the salt water corroded the knot faster than they'd calculated. But somewhere in the cold, black water between Sydney and the open sea, a piece of Jim Smith came loose. An arm. Left side. Still wrapped in a length of rope at the wrist where they'd tried to secure it. It drifted, caught in the current, rose toward the light. And 4 days later, 4 days of drifting with the tide, bloating in the salt, being nibbled by crabs and small fish, it floated into the hunting grounds of a 14-foot tiger shark that had been caught and imprisoned in a tiled pool at Coogee Beach. The shark was starving, sick, desperate. It ate the arm in 2 bites. Brady and Holmes didn't know any of this. They thought they'd won, thought the ocean would keep their secret forever, thought a trunk full of lead and rope and evidence was resting on the ocean floor where it would rust and rot and become just another piece of debris in Sydney's murky depths. They were wrong. In 5 days, the shark would get sick, and the perfect crime would come undone. The tiger shark was caught on April 3rd by a fisherman named Bert Hobson. Hobson ran a fishing charter out of Coogee, tourists mostly, wealthy types from Double Bay who wanted to pretend they were adventurers for an afternoon. But on this particular morning, he was alone, just him and his mate Charlie working the lines 2 miles offshore, hoping for snapper or jewfish to sell at the markets. What they got instead was a nightmare. The shark hit Hobson's bait like a freight train, nearly tore the rod from his hands. Charlie grabbed a gaff hook. Hobson braced his feet against the gunnel and held on. For 40 minutes they fought the beast, Hobson pulling, the shark diving, the line cutting grooves into his gloved palms. When they finally hauled it alongside the boat, both men went quiet. 14 feet from nose to tail. Over 1,000 pounds of muscle wrapped in gray sandpaper skin. Eyes like black coins, dead even when it was alive. Mouth full of serrated teeth that could bite through bone like butter. "Christ," Charlie whispered. "That's a monster." Hobson wiped sweat from his face. "That's money." The Coogee Aquarium baths had opened 2 years earlier. Part swimming pool, part exhibition hall. Not a modern aquarium with glass walls and filtered water. It was a repurposed ocean pool carved into the rocks, covered with a roof and lined with white tiles. Salt water pumped in from the ocean. Cold. Dark. Deep enough for swimmers in summer, now converted to house marine specimens for tourists who'd never seen a shark up close. The owner, a man named Charles Hobbs, paid Bert Hobson £50 for the shark. A fortune. Enough to feed a family for 6 months. They transported the beast in a water-filled truck bed, chains wrapped around its tail. Took 6 men to wrestle it into the pool. It thrashed the whole way, snapping at anything that came close. When they finally released it into the tiled basin, the shark sank to the bottom and didn't move for 42 hours. For 3 weeks, the shark was the biggest attraction in Sydney. Families came from all over the city. School children pressed their faces against the railing. Men in suits brought their secretaries on lunch breaks. Everyone wanted to see the monster from the deep. But the shark wasn't eating. Hobbs tried everything: fresh fish, chunks of beef, live crabs. The shark would circle past the food, inspect it with those dead black eyes, then ignore it. After a week, its movements became sluggish. After 2 weeks, it barely moved at all. By April 24th, the day before Anzac Day, the shark was dying. Hobbs stayed late that night, watching the pool. The shark lay on the bottom, gills barely moving. He considered putting it down, a mercy killing, but the holiday crowds were coming tomorrow. Anzac Day, biggest crowd of the year. He needed 1 more day of ticket sales. He went home, locked the doors, left the shark to die in the dark. April 25th, Anzac Day, the most sacred date on the Australian calendar. 20 years since the landings at Gallipoli. 20 years since Australian boys charged Turkish machine guns on a beach 10,000 miles from home. The survivors marched in the dawn service, medals pinned to their chests. The families of the dead laid wreaths. And by mid-morning, after the ceremonies ended, the crowds wanted distraction from grief. They came to Coogee Beach, hundreds of them, families, children with sticky hands and sun hats, soldiers on leave looking for something to do, all willing to pay 6p to see the monster. But something was wrong with the shark. It had moved to the surface, thrashing, slamming its head against the tiled walls. Its movements weren't predatory, they were desperate, dying. A crowd of 200 people watched, some cheering, thinking it was a show, while others began to feel uneasy. A mother pulled her child back from the edge. "Something's wrong with it." The shark convulsed. Its whole body seized like it had been electrocuted, and then it vomited. A rat appeared first, dead, bloated. It bobbed to the surface, spinning slowly in the current. Then a bird, feathers matted, one wing broken. The crowd laughed nervously, disgusted but fascinated. Children squealed, flashbulbs popped. And then the third thing came up. Someone screamed, a real scream, not surprise, but horror. A mother grabbed her children and ran. Men pushed forward to see. Others stumbled backward. Within seconds, the orderly crowd became a stampede. People shoving toward the exits, children crying, flashbulbs still popping from photographers who smelled a story. The arm floated in the center of the pool, turning slowly, the rope at the wrist dark against the pale skin. 2 constables stationed nearby for crowd control arrived within minutes. They pushed through the fleeing families, shouting for calm. One of them looked into the pool, saw the arm, and immediately radioed for detectives. Within the hour, the Coogee Aquarium baths was a crime scene. The lead detective was Inspector William Lovell, 20 years on the force, veteran of the war. He'd seen bodies before, French fields, Turkish trenches, Sydney back alleys. But this was different. He crouched beside the arm on the tarp, pale as driftwood, muscle definition still visible. This man had been strong, athletic. The rope around the wrist told a story. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't bitten off, the police surgeon said, kneeling beside him. Look at the shoulder joint, clean cut. A saw, most likely. Post-mortem. Lovell's jaw tightened. This was murder. And there, on the forearm, was a tattoo. 2 boxers, fighting stance, fists raised. Someone in the crowd of remaining onlookers whispered, "I know that tattoo. That's Jim Smith." Lovell looked up. "Get me fingerprints, get me an identification, and find out who the hell Jim Smith was and why he's floating in pieces in a goddamn shark tank on Anzac Day." The perfect crime had just vomited itself into public view, and the hunt was about to begin. The arm arrived at the police morgue in a zinc-lined box packed with ice. Inspector Lovell stood in the examination room watching the police surgeon lay it out under the surgical lamps. Dr. Palmer had been cutting open bodies for 15 years, drowning victims pulled from the Harbour, razor gang casualties, industrial accidents at the docks. He'd learned not to flinch. But this was different. "Severed cleanly," Palmer said, pointing with forceps at the shoulder joint. "Saw marks. Someone who knew what they were doing. Or at least someone with steady hands and a strong stomach. Post-mortem severance, there's no vital bleeding pattern." Lovell lit a cigarette. "How long in the water?" 4, maybe 5 days. The salt water preserves soft tissue, slows decomposition. But the rope, Palmer indicated the length of cord still tied around the wrist. That's fresh. Good quality marine rope, the kind you'd use on a boat. The tattoo? Palmer adjusted his glasses. Looks like amateur work. Prison ink, maybe, or done in a back alley shop. But it's distinctive enough for identification. Lovell nodded. What about fingerprints? Viable. The water damage is minimal. I can get you clean prints within the hour. By 6 o'clock that evening, they had a match. James Robert Smith, age 34. 3 prior arrests: assault, illegal gambling, receiving stolen goods. Last known address in Darlinghurst. No family listed. Occupation: boxer, laborer, odd jobs. But there was something else in Smith's file that made Lovell's blood run cold. A notation in red ink dated March 15th. Police informant, active. Lovell called his sergeant into the office. Arthur McKay, 20 years on the force, built like a brick shithouse, Glasgow accent still thick after 15 years in Australia. Smith was one of ours, Lovell said quietly. An informant. McKay swore. Feeding us information on who? Lovell flipped through the file. Patrick Brady. Forgery operation. And, he paused, Reginald Holmes. Smuggling. The 2 men looked at each other. They both knew what this meant. If Smith was blackmailing criminals and informing on them simultaneously, he'd painted a target on his own back the size of Sydney Harbour. Bring them both in for questioning, Lovell ordered, separately. I want to see their faces when we tell them we found Smith. They picked up Patrick Brady at 8 o'clock that night outside his print shop. He was locking the front door, whistling, preparing to drive home to his wife and dinner. When he saw the 2 detectives standing beside his car, his whistling stopped. Mr. Brady, Detective Sergeant McKay said, need to ask you some questions down at the station. Brady's face remained calm. Perfect. The mask of an innocent man inconvenienced by bureaucracy. What's this about? Jim Smith. Who? McKay smiled without warmth. Boxer. Worked for you running deliveries. Went missing about a week ago. I employ a lot of people, Sergeant. Can't keep track of every casual laborer. Funny thing, McKay said, opening the car door for him, polite but firm. His arm turned up this afternoon. In a shark's belly, on Anzac Day. Made quite a scene at Coogee. Brady went pale. Actually pale. For just a moment, the professional criminal facade cracked, and McKay saw genuine shock underneath. Brady got into the police car without another word. Lovell let Brady sit in silence for 5 minutes before speaking. When did you last see Jim Smith? Brady folded his hands on the table. Steady. I honestly don't recall the man, Inspector. You said he did deliveries? I run a legitimate printing business. I have dozens of contractors. Legitimate, Lovell repeated. That why you've got 3 priors for fraud? Paid my debt to society. Reformed man. Lovell opened the folder, slid a photograph across the table. The severed arm, pale and terrible under the morgue lights. The tattoo visible. The rope around the wrist. Recognize that? Brady stared at the image for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful. That's horrible, but I don't see what it has to do with me. Smith was blackmailing you. Brady's eyes flickered. That's absurd. You paid him over £100 in the last 6 weeks. We've got witnesses who saw him leaving your shop with envelopes stuffed with cash. Brady leaned back. If I gave money to a contractor, it was payment for services rendered. What services? Be specific. Deliveries, like I said. Lovell stubbed out his cigarette. Here's what I think happened, Mr. Brady. I think Smith was bleeding you dry, threatening to expose your forgery operation, so you decided to solve the problem. Permanently. That's quite a theory, Inspector. Pity you can't prove any of it. And that was the problem. Lovell knew it. McKay knew it. Brady sure as hell knew it. They had an arm, not a body, not a witness, not a murder weapon, not even a crime scene. And Australian law in 1935 required a corpus delicti, a whole body, to prove murder. An arm wasn't enough. You're free to go, Mr. Brady. For now. But don't leave Sydney. Brady stood, smoothed his suit. I wouldn't dream of it, Inspector. I'm a law-abiding citizen. He walked out of the station into the rain, and Lovell watched him go, jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. Brady didn't go home. He went to a payphone 3 blocks from the station and made a call. Reginald Holmes answered on the second ring. We have a problem, Brady said quietly. They found him. The shark vomited him up at Coogee in front of 200 people. Silence on the other end. Then, Christ. They questioned me. They know about the blackmail. They know about you. What did you tell them? Nothing. But they're coming for you next. Holmes looked out at the dark water where they'd dumped the trunk 5 days ago. They'd done everything. Right. Weights, rope, deep water, no witnesses. Everything except account for a sick shark with a taste for human flesh. What do we do? Holmes asked. Brady's voice was flat, cold. We stick to the story. No body, no murder. They can't prove anything. And if they find the trunk? They won't. It's 3 miles out in 50 feet of water. Holmes closed his eyes. They found the arm, Patrick. Silence. Then Brady hung up. In the morning, the detectives would come for Reginald Holmes, and the wealthy boatbuilder would make a decision that would turn a murder investigation into the most spectacular chase Sydney Harbour had ever seen. Reginald Holmes didn't sleep the night of April 25th. He sat in his office overlooking the harbor, a bottle of whiskey on the desk, watching the water turn from black to gray as dawn broke. Brady's phone call kept replaying in his mind. They found him. The shark vomited him up. 5 days. They'd lasted 5 days thinking they'd gotten away with it. Holmes poured another drink. His hands were shaking. He'd killed men before. Not personally, not like Brady had with Smith, but he'd arranged things. Smuggling wasn't a gentleman's business. Competitors disappeared. Informants ended up in the harbor with their feet in concrete. It was the cost of doing business in Sydney's underworld. But this was different. This was sloppy, public. A severed arm vomited up by a carnival attraction on the holiest day of the Australian calendar. This was a disaster. A knock at the door made him jump. Holmes looked at the whiskey bottle, then at the speedboat, then at the drawer where he kept his revolver. He made a choice. Instead of opening the door, Holmes ran, down the back stairs, through the workshop, past the half-built yacht frames and coiled ropes and cans of varnish, out onto the dock where his speedboat waited in the morning mist. He jumped into the speedboat, untied the mooring lines with fumbling hands, hit the starter. The engine roared to life. Holmes opened the throttle. The speedboat leapt forward, bow lifting, spray exploding on either side. He'd built this boat himself 2 years ago. Sleek mahogany hull, racing engine, capable of 30 knots on calm water. Fastest thing on Sydney Harbour. Behind him, the water police were already scrambling. The chase was on. Holmes knew these waters like he knew his own hands. Every reef, every current, every hidden channel between Garden Island and the eastern shore. He'd smuggled cargo through here 100 times in the dark. He could lose them. He had to lose them. The water police launch was gaining. Bigger engine, heavier, but faster in open water. Holmes saw them closing the distance. 200 yards, 150, 100. He yanked the wheel hard to port, cutting between two moored cargo ships. The speedboat heeled over, spray flying. The police launch tried to follow, couldn't make the turn, had to swing wide. Holmes gained 50 yards. But there were more police boats now, 3, 4, coming from different directions. They were boxing him in, herding him toward the eastern shore where the harbor narrowed and there was nowhere left to run. Holmes's heart was hammering. The whiskey burned in his gut. His vision blurred. He wasn't thinking clearly. Panic and alcohol and sleeplessness turning his brain to fog. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the revolver. Later, the police would never be sure what he intended. Was he planning to shoot at them? Threaten suicide if they came closer? Or had he simply decided, in that moment of trapped desperation, that death was better than Long Bay jail? Whatever the reason, Reginald Holmes put the gun to his own head. The bullet entered his skull just above the right ear and flattened against the bone. Medical impossibility. Miracle. Dumb luck. The bullet, small caliber, poor quality ammunition, hit his skull at just the wrong angle. Instead of penetrating, it flattened like a coin against the bone and ricocheted along the inside of his scalp. Agonizing, bloody, but not fatal. Holmes was still alive, still conscious, still driving the boat. Blood poured down the side of his face. He couldn't see clearly, couldn't think, but his hands stayed on the wheel. The speedboat kept racing forward, now completely out of control, weaving across the harbor like a drunk man running. The water police pulled alongside. One officer jumped from the police launch into Holmes's speedboat while it was still moving at 20 knots, a feat of either bravery or madness. He grabbed the wheel, cut the throttle. The engine died. The speedboat coasted to a stop, rocking in its own wake. Holmes was conscious, barely. He looked up at the officer standing over him, rain mixing with blood on his face. "I didn't mean to kill him," Holmes whispered. Brady did it. I just helped with the trunk." The officer's eyes went wide. He keyed his radio. "Inspector Lovell, you're going to want to hear this." Reginald Holmes survived his own suicide attempt. The bullet had traveled around the inside of his skull like a pinball, came to rest against the bone at the base of his neck. Surgeons would remove it 3 days later. Holmes would live with migraines for the rest of his life, but he was alive, and terrified, and ready to talk. Over 6 hours, Reginald Holmes confessed everything. The blackmail, the meeting with Brady, the murder in his boat workshop, the trunk, the weights, the disposal at sea. He drew maps, named dates, gave details only someone who'd been there could know. And at the end, he agreed to testify against Patrick Brady in court. "I'll tell them everything," Holmes said. "Everything. Just, I don't want to hang." Lovell closed his notebook. "You cooperate fully, Mr. Holmes, and we'll see what we can do about keeping the noose off your neck." Holmes nodded, closed his eyes, the weight of confession settling over him like a burial shroud. The trial date was set for June 12th. Patrick Brady was arrested that evening and charged with the murder of James Robert Smith. And for the first time since the shark vomited up that pale arm on Anzac Day, Inspector Lovell felt like justice might actually be served. He had no idea what was coming. The shark arm case became the story of the year. Every newspaper in Australia ran it on the front page. The Sydney Morning Herald, the Daily Telegraph, even papers in Melbourne and Brisbane picked it up. A severed arm, a carnival shark, Anzac Day, a spectacular Harbour chase, a suicide attempt that failed, and now a murder trial that promised to expose the underbelly of Sydney's criminal empire. The public couldn't get enough. The trial was set for June 12th, 6 weeks after the shark's vomit changed everything. Patrick Brady sat in his solicitor's office 3 days before the trial, smoking a cigarette and looking remarkably calm for a man facing the gallows. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed man named Clancy, who specialized in defending men who could afford his rates, laid out the situation. "The Crown's case rests entirely on Holmes's testimony. They have no murder weapon, no crime scene, no body, just an arm. And Holmes is a confessed accessory with every reason to lie to save himself." Brady stubbed out his cigarette. "So we discredit him?" "Exactly. He's a criminal, a smuggler. He tried to kill himself rather than face justice. The jury won't trust a word he says." "And the corpus delicti rule?" Clancy smiled. "There's no precedent in Australian law for convicting someone of murder when you only have part of the body. The defense will argue that without a complete corpse, there's no proof Smith is actually dead. For all we know, he could be alive somewhere, missing an arm." It was absurd, legally absurd, but it was also technically correct. Brady leaned back in his chair. "So I walk. If Holmes testifies the way he did in his statement, it'll be difficult. But if anything happens to undermine his credibility, or his testimony..." Clancy let the sentence hang. Brady said nothing, but his eyes were cold. Reginald Holmes was a dead man walking, and he knew it. The police had him under guard. Protective custody, they called it. A constable, stationed outside his house day and night. Another following him when he left. The Crown prosecutor had assured him he'd be safe, but Holmes had spent 20 years in Sydney's underworld. He knew how these things worked. Brady had connections, money, friends in places the police didn't even know existed, and Holmes was the only thing standing between Brady and freedom. His wife tried to make conversation, asked about the trial. Holmes barely heard her. He was thinking about the courtroom, the witness stand, standing up in public and admitting to murder, to dismemberment, to everything. And then what? Even if they honored the deal, even if they didn't hang him, he was looking at 20 years in Long Bay Jail. 20 years in a concrete box, with men who'd kill him for being a police informant the moment the guards turned their backs. He drank until midnight, then told his wife he was going to sleep in the car, said he needed air, needed to think, couldn't breathe in the house. She didn't argue. She'd stopped arguing with him weeks ago. Holmes took a blanket and a bottle and went out to his car parked in the driveway. The police guard nodded at him. Holmes got in the back seat, locked the doors from the inside. Rain hammered the roof. He must have fallen asleep, because he didn't hear the car door being picked, didn't hear the man climb into the front seat, didn't see the revolver until it was too late. The police guard heard the shots, came running, found Holmes slumped in the back seat, 3 bullets in his chest, blood soaking into the blanket he'd wrapped around himself. Dead. The killer was gone. No witnesses, no evidence except 3 spent shell casings and a car door that had been expertly picked. Inspector Lovell stood in the rain outside Holmes's house and knew exactly what had happened. Brady had ordered the hit, or done it himself. Either way, the only witness was dead. The Crown prosecutor arrived an hour later, took one look at the scene and shook his head. Can we proceed without him? Lovell wanted to say yes, wanted to believe they could still convict Brady on the physical evidence, on Holmes's written confession, on the arm with the rope and the tattoo. But he knew the truth. No, not without the body, not without Holmes's testimony. The defense will tear us apart. The trial lasted 4 hours. The Crown presented their evidence, the severed arm, the fingerprints identifying it as Jim Smith, the tattoo, the rope, Holmes's written confession implicating Brady. But without Holmes alive to testify, the confession was hearsay, inadmissible. And without a complete body, there was no corpus delicti, no proof of murder. Brady's lawyer stood and addressed the jury with perfect legal precision. Gentlemen, the prosecution would have you believe that my client murdered a man based on the discovery of a single arm. But where is the body? Where is the proof that James Smith is actually dead? For all we know, Mr. Smith severed his own arm in an industrial accident and fled Sydney in shame. Or perhaps he was attacked by the very shark that later vomited up his limb. We simply don't know. And as for Mr. Holmes's statement, a man who confessed to accessory to murder to save himself from hanging, who then conveniently dies before he can be cross-examined, the defense submits that this is nothing more than the desperate lies of a criminal trying to shift blame. The jury deliberated for 90 minutes. When they returned, the foreman stood. On the charge of murder, how do you find? Not guilty. Patrick Brady walked out of the Central Criminal Court a free man. The newspapers called it a miscarriage of justice. The police called it murder getting away with murder. Legal scholars called it a fascinating case study in the corpus delicti requirement. Brady called it good luck. He moved to Melbourne 3 months later, changed his name, started a new business, and never spoke about Jim Smith, Reginald Holmes, or a certain tiger shark ever again. The perfect crime had worked after all, not because they'd planned it perfectly, but because a sick shark vomited at exactly the wrong time, and a desperate witness died at exactly the right one. The tiger shark died 3 days after it vomited up Jim Smith's arm. Died of starvation in that tiled prison, its body finally giving out after weeks of refusing food. The aquarium workers found it floating belly up on the morning of April 28th, just as the newspapers were screaming about the Harbour chase and Holmes's confession. Charles Hobbs, the aquarium owner, had the carcass hauled out and buried on Coogee Beach. No ceremony, no memorial, just a hole in the sand and a creature that had inadvertently solved a murder being thrown away like garbage. Within a month, the Coogee Aquarium baths closed permanently. The public stopped coming. Nobody wanted to swim where a dead man's arm had floated. Nobody wanted to bring their children to the place where Anzac Day had been turned into a carnival of horror. Hobbs tried to rebrand, tried to bring in new attractions, but the damage was done. The building stood empty for years. During the Second World War, it was used briefly as a storage facility, then demolished in 1953. Now it's just a footnote in Sydney's history, a place where something impossible happened once, and nobody wanted to remember. But the case itself, the case lived on. The shark arm case became precedent. Legal scholars studied it, debated it, wrote papers on the corpus delicti requirement, the principle that you needed a whole body, or at least substantial remains, to prove murder. The case exposed a loophole in Australian law big enough to drive a truck through. Within 5 years, the law was changed. New South Wales updated its criminal code. A body part could constitute sufficient evidence of death if it could be positively identified and showed clear signs of foul play. Jim Smith's severed arm had rewritten the legal definition of murder. Patrick Brady disappeared into Melbourne and lived another 12 years. He changed his name to Patrick O'Brien, opened a legitimate printing business, married a woman who knew nothing about his past, had 2 children. By all accounts, he became exactly what he'd always pretended to be, a respectable businessman. But he never stopped looking over his shoulder. Every knock on the door made him jump. Every police car passing in the street made his blood run cold. He slept with a revolver under his pillow until the day he died of a heart attack in 1947, clutching his chest in his print shop while his employees called for an ambulance that arrived too late. The coroner ruled it natural causes, but the men who knew Brady, the ones still alive from Sydney's underworld, said the guilt killed him. Said he never got over what happened to Smith, never got over Holmes being murdered, never stopped hearing the splash of that trunk hitting the water. Inspector William Lovell never forgave himself. He'd promised Holmes protection, posted a guard, done everything by the book, and Holmes had still ended up dead in the back of his own car. 3 bullets in his chest on the morning of the trial that would have put Brady away for life. The Holmes murder was never solved. No witnesses, no evidence. The hitman, if there was a hitman, vanished like smoke. Lovell kept both files on his desk for the rest of his career, the shark arm case and the Holmes murder. 2 open wounds, 2 failures. When he retired in 1946, he took copies home with him, told his wife he'd solve them eventually. He died in 1952 without ever closing either case. Jim Smith was buried in an unmarked grave in a pauper cemetery in Botany. Just the arm. That's all they had to bury. No family came, no friends. The boxing community held a small memorial at a Woolloomooloo pub. 40 men who'd seen him fight, drinking to his memory and telling stories about the time he knocked out a man twice his size in the 3rd round. But nobody knew the whole truth about Smith. Nobody knew if he was a hero or a villain. An informant trying to do the right thing, or a blackmailer who got what was coming. The newspapers called him a victim. The police called him a complicated asset. The criminals called him a rat who should have known better. The story refused to die. Every decade, some journalist would rediscover it, write a feature article, interview the surviving witnesses, fewer each time as the years passed. The shark arm case became legend, became myth. The details got embellished. People claimed the shark had been 20 feet long, that Holmes had escaped the police 3 times before being caught, that Brady had confessed on his deathbed. None of it was true. But the truth was strange enough. Sydney grew. The Depression ended. The war came and went. The razor gangs faded into history. The sly-grog shops became legal pubs. The cocaine trade moved underground and then roared back in the 1970s. The city rebuilt itself a dozen times over. But every few years, someone remembers the shark arm case. Tour guides tell the story to tourists at Coogee Beach. True crime podcasts dissect it. Law students study it in their textbooks. And sometimes, late at night in Sydney's remaining old pubs, old men who remember the 30s will buy a round and tell the younger generation about the time a shark solved the murder that the police couldn't. The trunk was never found. 3 miles offshore, 50 feet of water, 70 years of tides and currents and shifting sands. It's down there somewhere. Rusted to nothing by now, the weights corroded, the rope rotted. The contents long since scattered by crabs and fish and time. Jim Smith's final resting place, not in a pauper's grave in Botany, but in the cold, dark water where Sydney's secrets go to die. The shark arm case remains officially unsolved. Patrick Brady was acquitted, never retried, never convicted. Reginald Holmes's murder was never solved, the killer never caught. And Jim Smith's death, the moment Brady's cosh came down in that boat workshop, has no witnesses left alive to testify. But the arm tells the story. The arm with the tattoo of 2 boxers, fists raised, fighting stance. The arm that floated up when it should have stayed down. The arm that turned a perfect crime into Sydney's most famous unsolved mystery. Because in the end, the shark did solve the murder. It just couldn't make the law care enough to do anything about it. Inspector Lovell stood on the deck of the police launch and stared at 3 square miles of empty ocean. Somewhere down there, 50, 60, maybe 70 feet below the surface, was the rest of Jim Smith's body, locked in a metal trunk, weighted with lead. Exactly where Reginald Holmes had marked on the map during his confession. Finding it would make the case unbreakable. A whole body, physical evidence, the murder weapon possibly still inside. Everything they needed to hang Patrick Brady and put this nightmare to rest. "This is the area?" Detective Sergeant McKay asked, looking at the endless gray water. Lovell nodded. "Holmes said 3 miles offshore from Bradley's Head. Deep water, beyond the shipping lanes." "That's a lot of ocean, sir." "I'm aware." They'd been searching for 2 weeks, every day when the weather allowed. Police divers in heavy brass helmets walking the ocean floor in grid patterns, grappling hooks dragged across the bottom, borrowed sonar equipment from the Navy, experimental technology, barely reliable. Nothing. The divers reported the same thing every time. Rocks, sand, old anchors, fishing nets, broken bottles, the debris of a working harbor. But no trunk, no body, no evidence. The problem was simple. Holmes had dumped it at night. Drunk, panicked, in rough water. His estimate of 3 miles offshore could have been 2 miles or 4. His landmark of Bradley's Head could have been off by half a mile in either direction, and the trunk could have shifted. Currents moved things. Storms stirred up the bottom. 2 weeks of tides could have pushed it anywhere. By the end of May, Lovell called off the search. They didn't have the resources, didn't have the technology, and the Crown prosecutor was getting impatient. The trial was scheduled for mid-June, and they needed to prepare their case with or without the trunk. "We have Holmes's confession," the prosecutor said. "We have the arm, we have the rope, the tattoo, the fingerprints. We can make this work." Lovell wanted to believe him. The city was obsessed. The shark arm case was all anyone talked about. In pubs, in offices, on trams, in factories. Theories flew like confetti. Some people thought Brady was innocent, framed by Holmes. Others thought there was a third man, a mysterious mastermind who'd orchestrated everything. Conspiracy theories bloomed in the tabloids. Maybe Smith wasn't dead at all. Maybe he'd cut off his own arm as part of an insurance fraud. Maybe the whole thing was a communist plot. The radio programs discussed it. Church sermons referenced it as evidence of Sydney's moral decay. Women's groups demanded action on organized crime. The police commissioner faced questions in Parliament. And through it all, two men waited. Patrick Brady, out on bail, living in his Ultimo home under police surveillance. Calm, confident, meeting with his lawyers every day. He knew the case against him was weak without the body. Knew that. Holmes was the only real threat. And Reginald Holmes in protective custody, growing more paranoid by the day. Holmes told anyone who'd listened that he wouldn't make it to the trial. He told his wife, told his lawyer, told the police guard assigned to protect him, told Inspector Lovell during a pre-trial interview. "Brady will have me killed before I testify," Holmes said, hands shaking around his whiskey glass. "I know how these things work. I've seen it before." Lovell tried to reassure him. "You're under police protection. We've got a man on your house 24 hours a day. Brady can't touch you." Holmes laughed, bitter, hollow. "You don't know Brady like I do, Inspector. He's got friends everywhere, coppers on his payroll, killers who owe him favors. I'm a dead man walking." Lovell increased the security. 2 guards now, one outside, one inside the house. Check-ins every 4 hours. Holmes was instructed not to leave without police escort. But Holmes was drinking, heavier, sleeping less. The stress was destroying him. His hair had gone gray in 6 weeks. He'd lost 20 pounds. The man who'd once been a successful boatbuilder with a beautiful harbor view was now a shell, counting down the days to either testimony or death. The police never proved it, never found the evidence. But everyone knew Brady was making arrangements. The underworld whispered about it in the sly-grog shops and gambling dens. A contract. £10,000 for the man who could silence Reginald Holmes before June 12th. Enough money to retire on. Enough money to disappear to Queensland or Melbourne and never look back. Professional killers came to Sydney from interstate. Men with no connection to Brady, no loyalty to anyone except cash. Ghost killers. The kind who did a job and vanished before the body was cold. The police knew this was happening. Couldn't prove it, couldn't stop it. All they could do was watch Holmes and pray their security held. Holmes started writing letters to his wife. Instructions for what to do with his business if he died. To his children, apologies for the shame he'd brought on the family. To his lawyer, demands for witness protection, for relocation after the trial, for guarantees the government couldn't possibly make. And one letter to Inspector Lovell, dated June 7th, 5 days before the trial. "Inspector Lovell, if you're reading this after I'm dead, know that I told you this would happen. Brady has won. He always wins. Men like him don't face justice. They buy their way out of it. I shouldn't have confessed. Should have kept my mouth shut. Should have died in that Harbour chase like I intended. At least then I wouldn't have spent these last 2 months waiting for a bullet I know is coming. Tell my wife I'm sorry. Tell my children their father tried to do the right thing at the end. It just wasn't enough." Reginald Holmes Lovell put the letter in Holmes's file and added another guard to the detail. 3 men now, watching the house in shifts. No one in or out without police clearance. It wouldn't be enough. 12 hours until the trial. 8 hours until Reginald Holmes would bleed out in the back seat of his own car. 6 hours until Patrick Brady's perfect crime would be complete. sharks were still circling. But this time, they were human. The police guard noticed the car first. Constable William Murray had been on duty since midnight, stationed on Holmes's front porch. Every hour he'd done a circuit around the property, checked the windows, tested the doors, looked in on Holmes in the car. The man had insisted on sleeping there, said he needed air, needed to think. Murray had checked at 2 a.m. Holmes was in the back seat, wrapped in a blanket, the whiskey bottle beside him. Breathing visible in the cold air. Alive. At 6 a.m., Murray checked again. Holmes was still in the back seat, but the blanket was dark with blood. The windows were spattered on the inside. Spray patterns, brain matter, bone fragments. And Holmes's chest had 3 holes in it. Entry wounds tight together. Professional grouping. Someone had shot him execution style while he slept. Murray ran for the house phone, dialed the station with shaking hands. "Officer down! No, witness down! Holmes is dead! Someone shot him! In his own bloody car!" Lovell arrived 20 minutes later, stood beside the car looking at the body through the fogged glass. He didn't open the door, didn't touch anything, just stared. Detective Sergeant Mackay came up beside him. "Sir?" Lovell's voice was flat, empty. "The trial starts in 3 hours." "I know, sir." "Our only witness is dead." "Yes, sir." Lovell turned to Murray, the night guard. The young constable looked like he was about to be sick. "Did you hear shots?" Murray shook his head miserably. "Nothing. I checked at 2 a.m. and he was alive. Checked again at 6 and..." His voice broke. "The lock?" Lovell looked at the house. Windows dark. Holmes's wife still asleep inside, not knowing her husband was dead 30 feet from her bedroom. The other guard had been stationed at the back of the property. Neither of them had heard anything. "Silencer," Lovell said quietly. "Professional hit. Someone walked up in the dark, picked the lock, shot him 3 times in the chest, and walked away. Holmes probably never woke up." McKay pulled out his notebook. "Time of death?" "Between 2 and 6 a.m., somewhere in that window." "Suspects?" Lovell almost laughed. It came out as a bitter cough. "Take your pick. Every killer in Sydney who wanted 10,000 pounds and had connections to Patrick Brady." The bullets were .38 caliber. Common. Untraceable. The kind used in 1,000 revolvers across Australia. The shell casings were gone. The killer had policed his brass. No fingerprints on the door. No witnesses. No evidence except a dead man and a professionally executed assassination. Lovell walked to the edge of the property and lit a cigarette with shaking hands. He'd promised Holmes protection. 24-hour guard. Safety. Justice. All of it a lie. Brady had reached out from across the city with his money and his connections and had erased the one person who could put a noose around his neck. McKay approached quietly. "What do we do about the trial, sir?" Lovell took a long drag. "Call the Crown Prosecutor. Tell him our witness is dead. Tell him the case just collapsed. We still have the arm, the physical evidence, Holmes's written confession. His confession is hearsay without him alive to testify, you know that. The defense will argue it was coerced. A desperate man lying to save himself from the gallows." Lovell flicked ash onto the wet grass. "And the arm? Without the body, without Holmes's testimony, Brady's lawyers will tie us in knots about corpus delicti. They'll argue we can't prove murder without a complete corpse. That's insane. That's the law." The Crown Prosecutor stood and addressed the court with a voice that sounded like defeat. "Your Honor, the Crown must regretfully inform the court that our primary witness, Mr. Reginald Holmes, was murdered early this morning at his residence in Tarahumara. Without his testimony, and in light of the unique evidentiary challenges of this case, the Crown is unable to proceed with the murder charge against Mr. Patrick Brady. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, shouts, journalists scrambling for the doors to phone their editors, the judge banging his gavel. "Order! Order!" Brady sat perfectly still. His face showed appropriate shock, appropriate dismay. But his eyes were calm, calculating, victorious. The judge looked at the Crown prosecutor. "Do you have any objection?" The prosecutor wanted to object, wanted to fight, but he knew he had nothing. "No, Your Honor." "Very well. The charges against Patrick Brady are dismissed. Mr. Brady, you are free to go." Brady paused at the courtroom doors, turned to face the reporters. "I am grateful that justice has been served. I am innocent of these charges, and always have been. My sympathies to Mr. Holmes's family. This entire situation is a tragedy." And then he walked out into the Sydney sunshine, a free man. Outside, the newspapers were already being rewritten. The public was outraged. Letters poured into Parliament. Editorials condemned the police. Radio programs debated how a protected witness could be killed 12 hours before testifying. Everyone knew Brady was behind it. Everyone knew he'd gotten away with murder twice. But knowing and proving were different things. Lovell opened a new file that evening, labeled it Holmes, Reginald, Murder, Unsolved. Put it right next to the shark arm file. 2 murders, 2 dead men, 1 killer walking free. He wrote a report recommending that surveillance be placed on Patrick Brady indefinitely, that his finances be audited, that any associates be investigated for possible involvement in Holmes's murder. The commissioner approved the surveillance. It lasted 6 months, produced nothing. Brady ran a legitimate business, paid his taxes, lived quietly. And in 1936, he moved to Melbourne and disappeared into a new life. The investigation into Holmes's murder went nowhere. No witnesses, no physical evidence. No suspect ever charged. The killer, whoever he was, had done the job perfectly and vanished. Some detectives thought it was Brady himself. Others thought he'd hired someone from interstate. A few conspiracy theorists suggested corrupt police were involved. Nobody knew. Nobody would ever know. Reginald Holmes was buried with full ceremony in Tarahumara Cemetery. His headstone read, "Beloved husband and father." No mention that he was a murderer. No mention that he died because he tried to do the right thing at the end. Just the sanitized version. The comfortable lie. Lovell stood at the grave after everyone else had left, rain soaking through his coat. "I'm sorry," he said to the fresh earth. "I promised you protection. I failed." No answer. Just rain and wind, and the knowledge that 2 men were dead, and the man responsible was drinking champagne in Melbourne. The perfect crime was complete, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. Sydney wouldn't let it go. Other crimes came and went. Razor gang slashings, warehouse robberies, domestic murders that filled the papers for a day and disappeared. But the shark arm case lived on like a ghost haunting the city's conscience. The newspapers ran editorials every week. "Justice denied," screamed the Daily Telegraph. "The murder that beat the law," from the Sydney Morning Herald. Letters flooded the editors, hundreds of them, demanding action, reform, consequences. The police came under fire. How had a witness under 24-hour guard been murdered? Why hadn't the search for Smith's body been more thorough? Were there corrupt officers on Brady's payroll? The police commissioner faced questions in Parliament. Internal investigations were launched. 3 officers were quietly dismissed for incompetence, though everyone knew it was a sacrificial gesture. Inspector Lovell was cleared of wrongdoing, but the stain remained. He'd been in charge. The witness had. Died on his watch. No amount of official exoneration could erase that. He kept investigating. Every lead, every rumor, every whisper from the underworld about who killed Holmes. He interviewed everyone who'd ever worked with Brady, checked financial records for unusual payments, followed up on tips from informants, most of them worthless, desperate people hoping for reward money. Nothing stuck. Brady had covered his tracks too well. Or maybe, as some suggested, he'd had help from inside the police force itself. Cops who'd looked the other way, who'd failed to patrol properly, who'd been conveniently absent when the killer arrived. Lovell didn't want to believe it, but he'd been a detective long enough to know that Sydney's police weren't immune to corruption. In the underworld, Brady became a legend. The man who'd beaten a murder charge with a shark as witness. The man who'd had his accomplice killed 12 hours before trial. The perfect criminal. Other forgers studied his methods. Other killers admired his nerve. And every criminal in Sydney knew, if you had money and connections, and the willingness to do what needed doing, you could get away with anything. The shark arm case became a blueprint, but it also became a warning. Within 2 years, New South Wales reformed its murder laws. The corpus delicti requirement was amended. A significant body part with positive identification could now constitute sufficient evidence of death. It became known informally as the Shark Arm Amendment. Legal textbooks cited the case. Law students studied it. Judges referenced it in rulings. Jim Smith's severed arm had literally rewritten Australian criminal law. A man who'd been a nobody, a boxer, a criminal, a police informant, had changed the legal system simply by being murdered in the right way at the right time. Jim Smith had no legacy except tragedy. His family, if he had any, never came forward. No one claimed the body. No one erected a proper headstone. He was buried with a number, not a name. Just another pauper in a field of anonymous dead. The boxing community held one memorial. 40 men in a Woolloomooloo pub drinking to a fighter who'd been good, but not great. They told stories for an hour. Then they moved on to other topics. Within a year, even they'd forgotten him. Smith existed now only in police files and newspaper archives, and the occasional retelling of the shark arm story. The victim. The dead man. The arm. Nothing more. Patrick Brady thrived. He'd reinvented himself as Patrick O'Brien, Irish heritage, legitimate printing businessman, family man. Within a year of leaving Sydney, he'd built a successful operation in Melbourne. Government contracts, wedding invitations, business cards for respectable firms. He married in 1937, a woman 15 years younger who knew nothing about Sydney, sharks, or severed arms. They had 2 children by 1940. Brady coached his son's cricket team, attended church on Sundays, donated to charity. The perfect citizen. But he never stopped looking over his shoulder. Those who knew him in Melbourne said he was nervous, anxious, started drinking heavily in the early 40s, had nightmares that woke him screaming. His wife learned not to ask about his past. His children learned that certain questions made their father's face go dark and distant. And every time a police car drove past his shop, Brady's hand would shake. Every knock on the door after dark made him reach for the revolver he kept in his desk drawer. He'd gotten away with murder, but he'd never gotten away from it. The Coogee Aquarium Baths was demolished in 1938. No memorial, no plaque, just removal. The tiled pool was filled in, the building torn down, the land sold. Eventually, it became a park, then a car park, then apartments. By 1950, nobody remembered exactly where the shark had been. The location of Sydney's most famous crime scene was lost to redevelopment and time, but the story lived on. It became urban legend, campfire story, cautionary tale. Parents told it to children to teach lessons about crime not paying, ignoring the fact that Brady had gotten away with it. Police recruits studied it as an example of case management failure. True crime enthusiasts collected newspaper clippings. The details got embellished. The shark grew bigger with each retelling. Holmes's chase became more spectacular. Brady became either a criminal mastermind or a lucky fool, depending on who was telling the story. But the core remained. A man murdered. An arm vomited up by a shark. Justice denied. Inspector William Lovell retired in 1946 without ever solving either case. The shark arm murder remained officially unsolved. Brady acquitted, no other suspects ever charged. The Holmes murder remained open. No arrests, no leads, no justice. Lovell took copies of both files home with him, told his wife he'd solve them in retirement. Spent his last years going through the evidence again and again, looking for the detail he'd missed, the connection he hadn't seen. He died in 1952, with both files on his bedside table. His children threw them away. The trunk was never found. Police looked for it periodically over the years. New technology, better sonar, commercial salvage operations doing unrelated work would sometimes search the area, hoping for reward money or fame. Nothing. If it's down there, and Holmes swore it was, it's been consumed by rust and current and time. The metal dissolved, the weights corroded, the contents scattered across the ocean floor. Jim Smith's final resting place, unknowable, unmarked, lost. And every few years, someone rediscovers the story. A journalist, a podcaster, a true crime documentary filmmaker. They interview the few remaining witnesses, fewer each decade, until finally there are none. They visit the locations. They examine the evidence. They propose new theories, but they always reach the same conclusion. Patrick Brady probably did it. Reginald Holmes definitely helped. Both men escaped justice. The law failed. The end. The shark arm case remains the perfect crime. Not because it was perfectly executed. It wasn't. They made mistakes, left evidence, got caught. But because when the law tried to exact punishment, the criminals were smarter, richer, more ruthless. And sometimes, that's all it takes. Patrick Brady died on March 14, 1947. Heart attack. Massive coronary. He was working in his Melbourne print shop when it hit. The same print shop he'd run legitimately for 11 years, the respectable business that had hidden his past beneath layers of normalcy. His employees found him on the floor, clutching his chest, gasping. They called an ambulance. It arrived 15 minutes later. The paramedics worked on him for 20 minutes. He died in the back of the ambulance, never making it to hospital. The official cause was heart failure. 52 years old. Stress, heavy drinking, decades of cigarettes. The medical examiner saw nothing suspicious, but those who'd known Brady in Sydney whispered different theories. The guilt killed him, they said. 12 years of looking over his shoulder. 12 years of nightmares about a severed arm floating in a shark tank. 12 years of waiting for the knock on the door that never came. his heart didn't fail. It broke under the weight of unpunished sin. Brady was buried in a Melbourne cemetery under his false name. His headstone read, Patrick O'Brien, beloved husband and father, 1895 to 1947. No mention of Sydney, no mention of forgery, no mention of murder. Just the sanitized lie, the comfortable fiction. His children never learned the truth about who their father really was. When Inspector Lovell heard Brady had died, he didn't feel satisfaction, just hollow emptiness. The man who'd murdered Jim Smith and arranged Reginald Holmes's execution had died in his sleep, unpunished, surrounded by family who thought he was a good man. No trial, no confession, no gallows. Just cardiac arrest and a quiet funeral, and a killer who'd beaten the law so thoroughly that even death couldn't touch him. Lovell updated the shark arm file one last time. Primary suspect, deceased. Case remains unsolved. Then he locked it in the cabinet and never opened it again. The arm itself was destroyed in 1955. Police policy dictated that biological evidence over 20 years old could be disposed of if the case was inactive. The arm, Jim Smith's left arm, the piece of him that had floated up and changed history, was incinerated in the police disposal furnace. The tattoo, the fingerprints, the rope, the physical proof that a man had been murdered. Gone, reduced to ash. The last tangible piece of Jim Smith erased from existence. By the 1960s, everyone directly involved was dead. Jim Smith, murdered 1935. Reginald Holmes, murdered 1935. Patrick Brady, died 1947. Inspector Lovell, died 1952. The shark, died 1935. Even most of the witnesses were gone. The families who'd seen the arm vomited up on Anzac Day. The detectives who'd searched the Harbour. The lawyers who'd fought the case. All dead. All silent. All beyond questioning. The shark arm case had outlived everyone who'd lived it. But the story wouldn't die. Every generation rediscovered it. Journalism students, crime historians, lawyers studying precedent. It appeared in books, Unsolved Australian Mysteries, The Dark History of Sydney Crime, When Sharks Solve Murders. Television documentaries interviewed the last surviving witnesses, elderly people with fading memories who'd been children on Anzac Day 1935. By the 1980s, even they were gone. In the 21st century, the case found new life online. Podcasts, YouTube videos, Reddit threads, true crime forums arguing about whether Brady acted alone or if there was a third conspirator. Amateur detectives proposing new theories. Historians debating whether the trunk could still be found with modern sonar. The shark arm case became immortal in the way only unsolved mysteries can be. Forever frozen in 1935, forever unanswered, forever debated. You can stand at Coogee Beach today and see nothing. No aquarium, no memorial, no plaque marking where a shark vomited up evidence that exposed a murder and changed legal history. Just beach, just ocean, just families on holiday who don't know they're swimming where Jim Smith's arm once floated in a tiled pool while 200 people screamed. History erased by time and tide and the city's need to forget its dark past. The trunk has never been found. Professional salvage teams have searched, marine archaeologists, treasure hunters hoping for fame or reward. Modern technology can see the ocean floor in detail impossible in 1935. But they find nothing. Either it's deeper than Holmes remembered, or the currents moved it, Or 70 years of rust and decay have consumed it so completely that it's indistinguishable from the thousands of other pieces of metal garbage littering Sydney Harbour's floor. Or maybe it was never there at all. Maybe Holmes lied. Maybe there was a different disposal method. Maybe the perfect crime included one last perfect lie. The Central Criminal Court still stands in Sydney. Historic building, heritage listed. Tours given to school groups and tourists. They talk about famous trials, colonial-era justice, constitutional cases. But they don't mention the shark arm case. Don't talk about the witness murdered before testimony. Don't discuss how a guilty man walked free because the law had a loophole you could drive a boat through. Some stories are too embarrassing, too damning, too clear an example of justice failing. In the end, 3 men died because of greed and fear. Jim Smith died because he thought blackmailing criminals was safer than honest work. Reginald Holmes died because he thought confessing would save him. Patrick Brady died free, but hunted by ghosts only he could see. And 90 years later, nobody mourns any of them. Smith's grave is unmarked and forgotten. Holmes's headstone is crumbling. Brady's family doesn't know he was a murderer. All 3 men erased, remembered only as components of a story, not as humans, not as people with hopes and fears and choices that led them to that terrible night in a boat workshop. Just the victim, the witness, and the killer, in Australia's strangest unsolved mystery. And the shark? The 14-foot tiger shark that started everything? It was buried on Coogee Beach in April 1935. But where exactly? Nobody recorded it. Nobody thought a dead shark mattered. Its bones are probably still there, somewhere under the sand, under the car parks and apartments and infrastructure of modern Sydney. The only innocent party in the entire case, buried and forgotten like everyone else. The shark arm case closed in 1935 with an acquittal. It remains closed, unsolved, unpunished, unforgotten. The perfect crime wasn't perfect because it was well planned. It was perfect because when everything went wrong, when the shark got sick, when the arm floated up, when Holmes confessed, the criminals were still smarter, richer, and more ruthless than the law. And sometimes, in 1930s Sydney, that was enough. There's a saying in Sydney's legal community: dark humor, the kind lawyers share over drinks after particularly frustrating cases. They call it pulling a Brady. It means getting away with murder through technicality, timing, and ruthlessness. It means understanding that the law isn't about truth or justice. It's about evidence, procedure, and knowing which rules can be bent until they break. Patrick Brady didn't invent that strategy, but he perfected it on Anzac Day, 1935, when a sick shark vomited up his crime and he still walked free. Somewhere out there, 3 miles offshore, 50 feet down, Jim Smith is still waiting. Waiting for justice that will never come. Waiting for a body that will never be found. Waiting in the cold, dark water where Sydney's perfect crimes go to rest. The shark arm case proved something uncomfortable about the law. Sometimes the guilty walk free not because they're innocent, but because they're clever. Because they have money. Because they're willing to murder witnesses and exploit technicalities and play the system like a rigged game. And sometimes, a shark can solve a crime that 100 detectives couldn't. But even a shark can't make the law care. Jim Smith was a boxer, a criminal, a police informant, and a blackmailer. He wasn't a good man, but he didn't deserve to be cut apart and thrown in the ocean like garbage. Reginald Holmes was a smuggler, a murderer, and a coward who tried to save himself by confessing. He didn't deserve 3 bullets in the chest on the morning he tried to do the right thing. Patrick Brady was a forger, a killer, and a man who beat the system so completely that he died of natural causes, surrounded by family who thought he was respectable. He deserved the gallows. He got a heart attack and a proper burial. The shark arm case is 90 years old. Everyone involved is dead. The evidence is destroyed. The locations are demolished or forgotten. Even the shark is. Bones in the sand. But the story survives because it's the perfect Australian noir, the perfect cautionary tale, the perfect example of how justice isn't always served and truth doesn't always matter, and sometimes the monsters win. So the next time you're at Coogee Beach watching your children swim in the ocean, remember this: somewhere out there, 3 miles offshore, in the deep, dark water, lies a trunk full of secrets that will never surface. And in every major city in the world, there's a Patrick Brady, a man who committed the perfect crime and got away with it, who learned that with enough money, enough connections, and enough ruthlessness, even a shark's testimony can be silenced. The shark told the truth. The law didn't listen. And Sydney just kept swimming. The shark arm case remains officially unsolved. Jim Smith's body has never been found. Reginald Holmes's murder was never solved. Patrick Brady was never retried. The trunk rests somewhere in Sydney Harbour, still waiting.